Good afternoon. My name is John Eric Setsos. I'm VP of Identity and Innovation at Signicat, and I work with identities. I've been doing that for many years now, and I'm going to be talking about the importance of knowing who you're dealing with, how to verify identities in the digital world. And of course, now this is really important with the COVID that's affecting all of us, and it's forcing us to go digital. Even those who don't want, they have to do that. Personal, a lot of people are working from home, and these are challenging times from an identity perspective. So the basic question is, how can you know who I am? And if you look at this one, which is now almost 28 years old, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Peter Steiner's asked this, and it's still the problem we're struggling with. To give a couple examples, I think this is kind of interesting. I overheard this myself. Somebody was gonna, they called the bank, so this was some years ago. They called the bank and they were gonna do a money transfer. And they didn't understand why they had to prove who they were, because they were not gonna steal anybody's money. They were gonna transfer out of their account. So the basic assumption that people know and understand who I am. But it's not only people. I found this one interesting as well. So my wife was on a support call with Apple, and it was about some shared issue. We had some shared problems, and she was asked, "Can't you just log into your husband's account?" And I mean, no, you should never do that. You should always use your own accounts. This also shows sort of the problem. I was asked and invited into a Slack channel on digital identity, and I said, thanks for letting me in. And I'm my name, and I work for Signicat. And first reply was, prove it. And of course, hey, that's the challenge. How do you prove something about yourself when you're online? So basic question, why? Why do I need to know who you are? Well, there's several reasons why. And of course, here we are at the FinTech Week, and of course, a very obvious one is regulations. I put up 3 important regulations. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but these are 3 important regulations. Of course, the Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which is about preventing terrorism and slavery. Regulation enforces knowledge of who is doing this transaction, as well as monitoring what kind of transactions you're doing. So AML is a really important part of it. PSD2 is also important. It's changing the landscape. So previously, I always, log directly into my bank, but that's not necessarily the case anymore. I'm logging into some service provider that then connects to my bank. And identity is a challenge in this picture, and of course, really important. As well as money transfers, I need to prove that I really want to transfer this money. EIDAS is also an important standard in this. EIDAS is about harmonizing electronic identities and trust services across Europe. And just to take one of the trust services, electronic signatures, it's quite obvious when you sign a document electronically, it is important to know who you are. So these are just some examples from a regulatory point of view where you really would need to know who you're dealing with. It's also part of fraud prevention. I mean, this article from FS Tech shows that impersonation scams have nearly doubled during COVID. And well, of course, I mean, so many inexperienced people are online, have to work from home. And I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of the fraudsters, this is a business opportunity, right, to do this. So we need to have really good measures in place to try to prevent that. And accountability. And that's interesting, sort of the new trust, the way of trust that we discussed in the previous panel, where I mentioned the level of trust where we now are in the distributed or digital trust, right? If you have, let somebody live in your Airbnb and you come back to a house that looks like this, well, you would want accountability. You would want somebody to be responsible, right? And also, if you're on the dating sites, well, you see some information about the other parties there. But can you know this is true? We know there are a lot of bots operating on these dating sites. And there have been fraud cases where, people have been talking and been friends and then done big payouts and so on. And you would want some sort of accountability. So you would need to know who is really behind it. Is it the real person? Is it a bot, etc.? And just some research, we did the Battle Dawn Border 4th edition. You'll find it on our website if you're interested. That showed 41% were unable to access financial services during COVID. And that's quite a high number. So identity is important. So what are the challenges? Why is this so hard? What are the problems we're struggling with? This is a picture that I have in my head. We have a real user who connects to a service. And I like to think of this as using an avatar. So I use my avatar. That could be my bank ID, for example. That could be, your Facebook ID or Google ID or whatever. Some sort of digital presence to connect to a service. And on the other side, that service will recognize me as this person. So, at least if I'm using bank ID. So I've logged on with bank ID. I'm using that bank ID avatar, if you like, to connect to the service, and that will recognize the person. Of course, the challenge, there are so many avatars. This is a challenge for the service provider that needs to meet users from a lot of different places and using all these EIDs. And also it's a problem for me as a person because I need to have a connection to these different EIDs. And also the question, how strong is the link to the real person? Well, of course, for some of these, it's very good. If you look at the bank ID, NEM ID, etc., it's a good process for onboarding. For some others, like Google or Facebook, well, the process is not really good. Can you really trust the person that they really are who they say they are? So the identification process is challenging in itself. Typically, you would use, in the Nordic at least, a combination of an EID. You would use identity paper that you would scan like a passport or something. You would do some liveness detection, proving you're a real person. Maybe a video interview. It's typically in Germany when you onboard, and you can verify your phone by sending a text message. So it's a combination of these things. So this is identifying who you are, which is the first step. And then, of course, validation. You need to validate something about the user. Is it a PEP? Is it authorized to act on behalf of an organization? What's the credit score, etc.? So this is validation. So showing that you can trust this person to do what they promise to do, or you need to do more checks for their identity. One important number also from the Battle Dawn board is that 63% abandon financial services, and this is a high number. It's a big loss for organization. You attract 10 people to your website and you lose 6 of them. So something to think about in this process, making it simpler. So this is the onboarding part, which is important. Now we've established a link between the physical user and this avatar, and that's good. Next question is, which is also challenging, who's using the avatar? Passwords are broken. Most people have a difficulty understanding it. And passwords were originally created to give access to something, like Alibaba in this figure. But we use it now to prove who we are. And there's some confusion around that, and people share their passwords either by accident because they live in the same household, or they say, well, hey, log in with my account. And Norwegian Bank ID ran some campaigns around that, never share your password. But still, people do it, and a lot of frauds are around that, because regardless of who is using the avatar right now, it will be recognized as the owner of that one. And that's important to remember. And it's still a challenge. Too many people share the credentials in a lot of places. Let somebody else use your avatar without really understanding what the consequences are. Of course, part of that picture to help that is using strong customer authentication as defined by PSD2. However, it's important to recognize, well, SMS OTP is broken. it's not really difficult to set up something to intercept if you do a targeted attack towards somebody, to pick up the SMSs and use that one. And in general, people do not want more thingies. We already have a really smart device that can do encryption, our cell phone. So we don't need more devices to do that. What we really need is some sort of smart app on the device that's linked to the user. So that's done, typically during the onboarding process. You do this linkage. It uses a secure back channel so that cannot be intercepted using strong encryption. And you will use then that to verify. Of course, you still have the challenge that in the same household, people will have access to each other's devices and maybe even share passwords. So that is a big challenge. And it's also due to lack of good authorization models that, instead of letting somebody borrow my avatar, I will say, well, I'm going to give you access to some of my things so you can pay a bill on my behalf or something. So just summarizing. 1, is the avatar linked to the right person? How is the onboarding process? As I showed, there's a lot of abandonment. This is too complex. It needs to be done simpler. In the Nordics, we said, well, it's so easy. We just use the bank ID. But that's sort of back to, well, in that onboarding process, can you trust it's the correct person using it? Or do you need to do additional checks? And of course, these additional checks are going to introduce more friction. And that's going to increase the abandonment rates. So this is challenging. How do you identify the user for the first time? And I said identification, knowing who you are, doesn't necessarily mean you will fulfill your obligations, which is why we need validation. Part of identification process is also, if you're in multiple countries, you need to access EIDs in a lot of different places, which is challenging because they use different protocols, etc. And you have the same process with validation. You need to look up information about individuals. There are a lot of different repositories for that. The challenge is that there is really no good standard for this information, no standard for what the attributes are named, for the syntax. Just look at the date, for example, all the date formats we have. What about name? Is it first name, last name? Are there separate attributes? Is it last name, comma, first name, etc.? So that's a challenge connecting to all repositories, especially if you have international customers. So validation is about validating information about the user so you can depend or have a higher degree of trust that they will fulfill the obligation. And then finally, authentication, which is the last challenge. Is we want a low friction, obviously. We can't do a really heavy process every time I'm using my avatar. It needs to be bound to me in a way that's simple to use, and also a way that nobody else can use it. And I mean, if you look at on the radar, there are ideas around solution about dynamic biometrics, and the cell phone, we know that it is in my possession and not somebody else running away with it. But still, we're not there yet. These are experiments, so still we are down to simple two-factor solutions. We have the password that we shouldn't share, but we do. We need some sort of device that people in the same household could use. So it is a challenge knowing exactly who's doing it, which is why we've seen some upcoming regulation, at least in Norway now, saying, well, a bank ID in itself may not be sufficient to take a loan, for example. The liability is put more on the bank side to prove who's really behind that. So identification, validation, and authentication. So that was my quick talk on identities. Thank you so much for your attention. If you're interested in reading the Battle to Onboard, you'll find a link at the bottom corner. We've also done some presentations on that and some discussions, so you'll find on our website some discussions around that if you're interested. We are doing a developer event. Time is not decided yet, but look up in the agenda. I'm sure you'll find it. And this is geared towards startups, and we're talking about identity and how to use the identity solutions. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And again, thank you so much for your attention.